I'm Elena, 34, and this is the story of how my parents' final act of favoritism led me to discover a secret that changed everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Before I go deeper into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. If you've ever stood your ground when someone failed to see your worth, feel free to let me know below. And if these kinds of stories speak to you, you're welcome to follow the channel for more. Growing up, I learned early that love in my family came with conditions, and apparently, I never quite met them. My younger brother David was 3 years younger than me, but from the moment he could walk, it was clear he could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. While I struggled with homework, at the kitchen table, David's mediocre grades were celebrated as if he'd cured cancer. When I brought home A's, my mother would glance at my report card and say, "That's nice, dear," before turning her attention back to whatever David was doing. The inequalities weren't subtle. They were glaring, consistent, and soul-crushing in their persistence. I remember my 16th birthday when my parents handed me a card with $50 inside, apologizing that they couldn't afford more. 2 months later, for David's 13th birthday, they surprised him with a brand new mountain bike that cost over $400. When I pointed out the discrepancy, my father looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "David's going through a growth spurt. He needs encouragement." College was where the favoritism reached its most devastating peak. I had worked part-time jobs since I was 14, saving every penny for my education. I applied for scholarships, wrote essays until my fingers cramped, and managed to secure partial funding for a state university. My parents contributed nothing, claiming they were teaching me responsibility. Meanwhile, David's college fund had been growing since he was born. When he graduated high school with a C average, they not only paid his full tuition to a private university, but also bought him a car and covered his living expenses. The explanations were always the same. David was finding himself. David needed extra support. David was going through a difficult time. I began to wonder what was so fundamentally wrong with me that I never seemed to deserve that same patience, that same investment, that same unconditional support. I spent my early 20s working multiple jobs while attending college full-time. I waitressed at night, tutored other students between classes, and spent my weekends cleaning houses. Every dollar I earned went toward tuition, books, or basic survival. During those years, I rarely came home for visits because I couldn't afford the gas money, and my parents never offered to help with travel expenses. Yet David came home every weekend with his laundry, his empty wallet, and his endless stories about fraternity parties and spring break trips that my parents funded without question. The pattern continued into our adult years. When David dropped out of college to pursue his passion in music, my parents supported his decision and continued sending him monthly checks. When I graduated with honors and landed my first marketing job, they forgot to congratulate me. I learned about David's new apartment lease from a Facebook post my mother shared, gushing about how proud she was of his independence. The apartment, I later discovered, was completely furnished and subsidized by my parents. By the time I turned 30, I had built a successful career in digital marketing, owned my own small apartment, and had managed to save enough money for a reliable car. These achievements felt hollow because the people who should have been proudest of me seemed perpetually disappointed that I wasn't more like David, who at 27 was still asking for money to cover his rent while pursuing his latest creative endeavor. The emotional toll of growing up as the forgotten child in a family of 3 is difficult to describe to people who haven't lived it. It's not just about the money or the gifts or the opportunities. It's about the constant message that your worth is somehow less than your siblings, that your struggles don't matter as much, that your successes aren't worth celebrating. It's about learning to expect disappointment so thoroughly that you stop hoping for anything different. I had spent years in therapy trying to understand why I felt so fundamentally unlovable, why I struggled to believe I deserved good things. Why? Every relationship I entered felt like I was auditioning for a role I was destined not to get. The answer was always there, sitting around my childhood dinner table, watching my parents' faces light up when David walked into the room while barely acknowledging my presence. After college, I made a conscious decision to stop expecting anything from my parents. If I was going to build a life worth living, it would have to be entirely my own creation. This realization was both liberating and terrifying because it meant accepting that the safety net most people take for granted simply didn't exist for me. My first job out of college was with a small marketing firm that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but I threw myself into the work with desperate determination. I stayed late every night, volunteered for projects nobody else wanted, and studied digital marketing trends until my eyes burned. While my coworkers complained about their workload, I was grateful for every opportunity to prove myself valuable. Within 2 years, I had been promoted twice and was managing client accounts that brought in significant revenue for the company. I negotiated my salary aggressively, saved ruthlessly, and slowly began to build the financial stability I had never experienced growing up. Every milestone felt like a small victory against the voice in my head that whispered, I wasn't worth investing in. The car became my symbol of independence. After riding public transportation for years and borrowing friends' cars for emergencies, I decided it was time to buy my own vehicle. I researched for months, comparing safety ratings, fuel efficiency, and maintenance costs. I wanted something reliable but not flashy, practical but not embarrassing. The Honda Civic I eventually chose was 3 years old with low mileage, and I paid for it entirely with my own savings. The day I drove that car off the lot was one of the proudest moments of my life. It represented everything I had built for myself without help, without family money, without anyone believing in me enough to invest in my future. The car was modest, but it was mine in a way that nothing else had ever been. I remember calling my parents to share the news, expecting perhaps a moment of recognition for what I had accomplished. My mother's response was polite but underwhelming. "That's practical of you," she said, as if I had announced I'd bought new socks rather than achieved a major life milestone. She quickly changed the subject to David's latest artistic project, which my parents were funding to the tune of several $1,000. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before she had to go help David move his equipment to a new studio space they had rented for him. I hung up the phone and sat in my new car in the parking lot of the dealership, feeling the familiar ache of invisibility that had followed me since childhood. But this time, something was different. I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I had something that was entirely mine, earned through my own effort and sacrifice. Their inability to celebrate my success said nothing about my worth and everything about their limitations as parents. Over the next few years, I continued to build my career and my independence. I changed jobs twice, each time increasing my salary and expanding my skills. I decorated my apartment exactly as I wanted it, traveled to places I had always dreamed of seeing, and slowly began to understand what it felt like to make decisions based on my own desires rather than trying to earn someone else's approval. The car served me well through all of these changes. It never broke down unexpectedly, never left me stranded, never demanded more from me than I could give. In many ways, it was the most reliable relationship I had ever had. I took meticulous care of it, following the maintenance schedule religiously and treating every oil change like a sacred ritual of self-respect. My parents rarely asked about my life during our infrequent conversations, but when they did, their questions always felt perfunctory, like items on a checklist they needed to complete before moving on to more interesting topics. They never asked about my work projects, my travel plans, or my personal goals. They never inquired about my car or seemed curious about how I had managed to afford it on my own. Meanwhile, David's life continued to be a source of endless fascination for them. His failed music career transformed into a photography phase, which then evolved into a food truck venture, each transition funded by my parents' seemingly bottomless well of financial and emotional support. At family gatherings, which I attended less and less frequently, the conversation always centered around David's latest endeavor and how proud my parents were of his creativity and entrepreneurial spirit. I stopped trying to compete for their attention or approval. Instead, I focused on building relationships with people who valued what I brought to their lives, who celebrated my successes without comparing them to someone else's, who saw my worth without requiring me to prove it constantly. These friendships became the foundation of the family I was creating for myself, one based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and favoritism. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was at home, reviewing client presentations for the next day's meetings, when my mother called with her artificially cheerful voice that always preceded bad news, disguised as family announcements. "Elena, honey, your father and I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over this weekend? We're having a family meeting." Family meetings in our household had historically been code for, "We've made a decision about your life without consulting you." I felt the familiar knot form in my stomach, but I agreed to come. After 31 years, I still harbored some pathetic hope that maybe this time would be different. Saturday arrived gray and drizzle-soaked, matching my mood as I drove my reliable Honda to my childhood home. David's motorcycle was already parked. In the driveway, an expensive machine my parents had helped him purchase 6 months earlier, when he decided he needed more freedom to explore his artistic vision. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just grown tired of feeling diminished every time I entered it. My parents sat on the couch they had owned since I was a child, while David sprawled in the recliner that had always been considered his unofficial throne. I took the wooden chair that had somehow become designated as mine over the years, straight-backed and uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat in the way he did when he was about to deliver news he knew would be unpopular, but had already decided was non-negotiable. "We've been thinking about the family resources and how to best support everyone's needs moving forward." The phrase family resources was rich, considering I had never been considered eligible for any of these mysterious resources. Throughout my entire adult life, I waited, knowing that whatever came next would somehow involve me giving something up for David's benefit. David has been offered a fantastic opportunity with a marketing firm in the city, my mother continued, her voice bright with the enthusiasm she reserved exclusively for my brother's endeavors. "It's exactly the kind of career pivot he needs, and we're so proud of him for recognizing that it's time to get serious about his future." I felt a mixture of incredulity and resignation. David, who had spent the last decade bouncing between creative pursuits while I built an actual career in marketing, was suddenly being celebrated for entering my field. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. "The thing is," my father continued, "the position requires reliable transportation, and David's motorcycle isn't practical for a professional environment. We've been discussing this as a family, and we think the best solution is for David to use your car." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I stared at my parents, waiting for the punchline, for some indication that they understood how insane their proposal sounded. Instead, they looked at me expectantly, as if they had just offered me a wonderful opportunity to contribute to the family's success. "You want me to give David my car?" I spoke slowly, making sure I understood correctly. "Well, not give exactly," my mother said quickly. "More like, share. You work from home sometimes, don't you? And you live close to public transportation. David really needs this job to work out, and having reliable transportation could make all the difference in his success." The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted me to hand over the car I had saved for months to buy, the car that represented years of financial discipline and personal sacrifice, so that David could have reliable transportation to a job in the career field I had been working in for nearly a decade without any family support or recognition. I bought that car with my own money, I said, my voice carefully controlled. I need it for my job, for my life. David is 28 years old. If he needs a car for work, he can buy one like every other adult. David finally spoke up, his tone carrying the entitled whine that had characterized his voice since childhood. Come on, Elena. You know I can't afford a car payment right now. I'm just getting back on my feet. This job could change everything for me. Then maybe you should have thought about that before spending the last 10 years having mom and dad fund your various artistic phases, I replied, surprised by the sharpness in my own voice. My parents exchanged the look they always shared when I dared to point out the obvious inequalities in our family dynamic. It was a look of disappointment mixed with confusion, as if they genuinely could not understand why I would be resistant to sacrificing for David's benefit. Elena, my father said in his stern parental voice, family means supporting each other. David has always been there for this family. The statement was so divorced from reality that I almost laughed. David had been there for this family the way a house guest is there for a hotel, consuming resources and providing little in return, except the occasional entertaining story. When has David ever been there for me? I asked. When has anyone in this family ever supported my career or my goals or my needs? I've been taking care of myself since I was 16 years old. And now you want me to hand over my car so David can have a better commute? The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken resentments and willful ignorance. My parents looked genuinely puzzled by my reaction, as if the idea that I might have needs or feelings worth considering had never occurred to them. We're not asking you to give up the car permanently, my mother said weakly. Just until David gets established in his new position. But I knew better. I knew that David's temporary need would become permanent convenience, that my sacrifice would become invisible expectation, that once again I would be the one asked to shrink so that David could expand. I stood up from the uncomfortable wooden chair and looked at the three people who shared my DNA but had never really felt like my family. No, I said simply. I'm not giving David my car. The word no hung in the air like a declaration of war. I had never refused a family request so directly, so completely. My parents stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language, their faces cycling through confusion, disappointment, and growing anger. Elena, don't be selfish, my mother said, her voice taking on the manipulative tone she had perfected over the years. This is about family. This is about helping your brother succeed. This is about the same pattern that's been playing out. My entire life, I replied, feeling a strange calm settle over me. David needs something, so Elena has to sacrifice. David wants something, so Elena has to go without. I'm done. My father's face was turning red, a sure sign that his patience was wearing thin. We raised you better than this. We taught you about generosity and putting family first. The hypocrisy was staggering. They had taught me about generosity by never showing me any. They had taught me about putting family first by consistently putting me last. I felt 31 years of suppressed anger bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest. You want to talk about family? I asked, my voice steadier. Then I felt. Let's talk about how you paid for David's entire college education while I worked 3 jobs to pay for mine. Let's talk about how you bought him a motorcycle last year while you've never helped me with a single car payment. Let's talk about how every conversation we have revolves around David's needs, David's dreams, David's future, while you can't even remember what I do for a living. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't deny any of my accusations. He couldn't, because they were all true. That's different, my mother protested weakly. David has had a harder time finding his path. You've always been so independent, so capable. We knew you could handle things on your own. So you punished me for being responsible? I asked. You decided that because I could take care of myself, I didn't deserve the same support and investment you gave David? Do you have any idea how that felt? Do you know what it's like to be the child who gets nothing because she doesn't ask for everything? The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I looked around at the family photos covering every surface, dozens of images of David's various milestones and achievements, and realized that I couldn't remember seeing a single picture of my college graduation, my first job, or any of the accomplishments I had achieved entirely on my own. "I'm keeping my car," I said firmly, "and I'm done pretending that this family's dysfunction is normal or acceptable." I walked to the front door, my legs feeling strangely unsteady. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice rising in pitch as she called my name, but I didn't turn around. David remained silent, probably calculating whether this family drama would interfere with his new job opportunity. "If you walk out that door, don't expect us to welcome you back," my father called after me, playing his final card. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, feeling the weight of 31 years of trying to earn love from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving. I stopped expecting to be welcomed here a long time ago," I said without turning around. The drive home was surreal. I had just severed ties with my family of origin, and instead of feeling devastated, I felt oddly relieved. The constant weight of disappointment and inadequacy that had followed me since childhood seemed to lift slightly with each mile I put between myself and that house. My phone buzzed with text messages throughout the evening. My mother sent long paragraphs about family loyalty and forgiveness. David sent shorter messages asking if I was really going to let this ruin our relationship. My father sent nothing, which was somehow more telling than any words could have been. I turned off my phone and sat in my apartment, surrounded by the life I had built entirely through my own effort. Everything around me belonged to me, not because someone had decided I deserved it, but because I had worked for it. The silence felt different from the loneliness I had experienced growing up. This silence was peaceful, free from the constant tension of trying to measure up to impossible standards. The next few months were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Holidays felt strange without the familiar disappointment of family gatherings. Birthdays passed quietly without calls that would have been perfunctory anyway. I missed the idea of family more than I missed the actual people, but I didn't miss the feeling of being invisible in a room full of my own relatives. I threw myself into work and friendships, building connections with people who appreciated my presence rather than tolerating it. Slowly, I began to understand what it felt like to be valued for who I was, rather than criticized for who I wasn't. 6 months after cutting contact with my family, I was settling into a new rhythm of life when the unexpected phone call arrived. It was a Tuesday morning in September, and I was reviewing quarterly marketing reports when my assistant knocked on my office door. "There's a lawyer online too," she said with the confused expression that meant this wasn't a business call. "He says it's about an inheritance." My first thought was that someone was trying to scam me. I had no wealthy relatives, no dying benefactors, no reason to expect anyone to leave me anything of value. My grandparents on my father's side had passed away when I was young, and my mother's parents had been distant figures who sent birthday cards with $5 bills until I turned 18. "This is Elena Martinez," I answered cautiously. "Ms. Martinez, this is Robert Chen with Chen, Williams, and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Holloway. I believe she was your maternal grandmother." My grandmother. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. And before that, our interactions had been limited to brief conversations at the occasional family gathering. She had always seemed like a peripheral figure in our family drama, someone who observed from the sidelines without getting involved in the favoritism and dysfunction that characterized my parents' household. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mrs. Holloway passed away 3 weeks ago," the lawyer continued. "I've been trying to reach you through the contact information she provided, but the phone number we had was disconnected. I realized he was probably referring to my old landline, which I had canceled when I moved apartments 2 years earlier." "I'm sorry to hear about her passing," I said, though truthfully, I felt more confused than sad. "But I'm not sure why you're calling me about her estate. Mrs. Holloway named you as the sole beneficiary of her will. Mr. Chen said gently. She left you her house and all of its contents, along with several financial accounts and investment portfolios. The words didn't make sense. My grandmother had lived in a small house that I remembered as cluttered and outdated. She had driven an old sedan and dressed in thrift store clothing. The idea that she had investment portfolios seemed as unlikely as learning she had been a secret astronaut. I think there might be some mistake, I said slowly. My grandmother and I weren't particularly close. We barely spoke, and I can't imagine why she would leave me anything, especially instead of my parents or my brother. There's no mistake, Mr. Chen assured me. Mrs. Holloway was very specific about her wishes. She actually updated her will quite recently, about 8 months ago. Would you be available to meet this week to discuss the details? I agreed to meet him Thursday afternoon, still convinced that this was some sort of administrative error that would be cleared up once we reviewed the paperwork. I didn't mention the call to anyone, not even my closest friends, because the whole situation felt too surreal to explain. Thursday arrived with unseasonably warm weather that made my business suit feel stifling as I walked into the law office, downtown. Mr. Chen was younger than I had expected, probably around my age, with the kind of gentle demeanor that suggested he specialized in helping people navigate grief and complicated family situations. Before we begin, he said as we settled into his office, I want you to know that your grandmother spoke about you specifically when she updated her will. She asked me to tell you that she had been watching your progress over the years and was proud of the woman you had become. The statement hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother had been watching my progress? She had been proud of me? These were words I had never heard from any family member, and hearing them now, after her death, felt both healing and heartbreaking. I don't understand, I said quietly. We hardly ever talked. I assumed she barely knew anything about my life. Mr. Chen smiled sadly. Your grandmother was more observant than people realized. She mentioned that she had been following your career through social media and had spoken with some of your former colleagues. She seemed to know quite a bit about your accomplishments. He opened a thick folder and began explaining the details of my inheritance. The house, which I remembered as modest and somewhat run down, was apparently worth significantly more than I had realized due to its location in a neighborhood that had undergone considerable development. There were also several savings accounts, a substantial investment portfolio, and something called a storage unit that had been paid up for the next 5 years. The total value of the estate is approximately $1.2 million, Mr. Chen said matter-of-factly, as if he hadn't just announced a number that represented more money than I could have saved in a decade. I stared at him, waiting for the information to make sense. My grandmother, who had lived so modestly that my parents occasionally worried about her finances, had been a millionaire. She had left everything to me, the granddaughter who visited twice a year and sent generic Christmas cards. Did she explain? Why she chose me? I asked, still struggling to process this turn of events. Mr. Chen consulted his notes. She said you were the only family member who had never asked her for money. She admired your independence and wanted to ensure that her assets went to someone who would appreciate their value rather than simply spend them carelessly. The implication was clear, even though he was too professional to spell it out explicitly. My grandmother had been aware of my parents' financial support of David over the years. She had watched me work multiple jobs and build my career without family assistance, and she had made her judgment about which approach demonstrated more character. There's also this, Mr. Chen said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name, written in shaky handwriting. She asked me to give this to you personally. The envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table for 2 days, while I processed the magnitude of what had happened. My quiet, unassuming grandmother had been secretly wealthy, secretly observant, and secretly proud of me in ways that my own parents had never been. The letter felt too important to read casually, too potentially life-changing to open without proper consideration. When I finally broke the seal, her familiar handwriting filled 3 pages of careful script. The letter began simply, My dear Elena, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably very confused about why I left you everything." She went on to explain that she had been a successful real estate investor for over 40 years, starting with a small duplex she had purchased shortly after my grandfather's death. She had reinvested her profits carefully, building a portfolio that had grown substantially over the decades. She had lived modestly, not out of necessity, but out of choice, preferring to save and invest rather than display her wealth. I watched. "You grow up," she wrote, "and I saw the way your parents treated you differently than your brother. I saw you working multiple jobs to pay for college while they handed David everything he asked for. I saw you celebrate your achievements alone while they celebrated David's mediocrity as if it were genius. It broke my heart, but I also saw how it made you strong." The letter revealed that she had been secretly documenting my family's dynamics for years, not out of gossip or judgment, but out of concern for how the favoritism was affecting everyone involved. She had tried to talk to my parents about the inequity, but they had dismissed her concerns as the meddling of an elderly woman who didn't understand modern parenting. "Your parents believe that love means giving someone everything they want," she continued. "But real love sometimes means letting someone struggle so they can discover their own strength. You discovered yours early, and I wanted to make sure you were rewarded for that discovery." The most shocking revelation came in the second page, where she explained that my parents had been asking her for financial help for years. She had been supplementing their income quietly, helping them maintain their lifestyle, and continue funding David's various pursuits. She had given them money with the understanding that some of it would be used to help me as well, but she had eventually realized that none of her contributions were ever directed toward my education or my needs. "I stopped giving them money 2 years ago," she wrote, "because I realized I was enabling the same patterns that were hurting you. I wanted to see if they would finally treat you fairly if they had to rely entirely on their own resources. Instead, they asked you to give up your car for David. That was when I knew I had made the right decision about my will." The letter explained that she had been planning to reach out to me directly, to build a relationship independent of my parents' dysfunction, but her health had declined more rapidly than expected. She had used her final months to arrange her affairs and ensure that her legacy would go to someone who would appreciate both its value and its meaning. "The house holds many secrets," she concluded. "I hope you will take time to explore it thoroughly before you decide what to do with it. There are things in the attic that will help you understand our family's history, and there are things in the garage that might surprise you." I drove to my grandmother's house that weekend with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The key Mr. Chen had given me felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet rooms where she had spent her final years. The house was exactly as I remembered it, filled with outdated furniture and the lingering scent of the lavender sachets she had kept in every closet. But now I saw it through different eyes, understanding that every modest choice she had made was intentional rather than necessary. I started with the attic, climbing the narrow stairs that creaked under my weight. The space was filled with carefully labeled boxes that contained decades of family history. There were photo albums I had never seen, documenting my childhood in ways that my parents never had. Pictures of me at school events, copies of report cards and awards, newspaper clippings from my college graduation that I hadn't known anyone had saved. One box contained correspondence between my grandmother and various family members, including letters from my parents that revealed the extent of their financial dependence on her generosity. I learned that she had paid for David's college tuition directly, despite my parents claiming they had covered the cost themselves. She had funded several of his artistic ventures, bought his motorcycle, and even paid for the deposit on his various apartments over the years. But the most revealing documents were the records she had kept of her conversations with my parents about me. Notes from phone calls where she had suggested they help with my college expenses, only to be told that I was too independent and didn't need assistance. Documentation of her offers to contribute to my first car purchase, offers that my parents had apparently never passed along to me. I spent hours in that attic, piecing together a family history that was completely different from the version I had lived. My grandmother hadn't been a distant, disinterested observer. She had been actively advocating for me behind the scenes, fighting battles I had never known were being fought, and becoming increasingly frustrated with my parents' stubborn favoritism. As the afternoon light began to fade, I remembered her. Mention of surprises in the garage. The space was accessible through a side door that had always been kept locked during my childhood visits. Inside, I found the usual collection of gardening tools and seasonal decorations, but also several items covered with tarps that looked far too expensive for the modest lifestyle my grandmother had appeared to maintain. Under the first tarp was a pristine vintage Mustang that looked like it had rolled off the showroom floor yesterday. Under the second was a collection of antique furniture that appeared to be museum-quality pieces. But it was the third tarp that stopped me in my tracks. Underneath was a sleek black Ferrari that gleamed under the garage's fluorescent lights. It was beautiful, powerful, and completely incongruous with everything I thought I knew about my grandmother's life. Next to it sat a small wooden box containing paperwork, insurance documents, and a set of keys with the distinctive Ferrari logo. Stood in that garage for a long time, trying to reconcile the image of my thrift store shopping grandmother with the reality of someone who had owned a Ferrari. The car was registered in her name and had been meticulously maintained, despite having very low mileage. According to the service records, she had driven it perhaps a dozen times in the past 5 years. A note tucked into the paperwork explained her reasoning. I bought this car not because I needed it, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. It represents the success I achieved through my own efforts, the same kind of success I see you building for yourself. I hope it will remind you that you deserve beautiful things, even if the people who should love you most have never made you feel that way. I held the Ferrari key in my palm, feeling its weight and the reality of what it represented. This wasn't just a car key. It was a symbol of a secret life my grandmother had lived, a life of financial success and quiet rebellion against the modest image she had maintained for her family's benefit. The Ferrari was a deep midnight blue that seemed to shift between black and navy depending on the angle of the light. It was immaculate, with leather seats that still smelled new and dashboard that gleamed with careful maintenance. According to the registration papers, it was only 3 years old, which meant my grandmother had purchased it when she was well into her 80s, long after most people would have considered buying a sports car practical or appropriate. I found myself laughing at the audacity of it. While my parents had been struggling to maintain their lifestyle and asking her for financial help, she had been quietly purchasing luxury vehicles and living according to her own desires rather than their expectations. The car represented a level of self-determination that I was only beginning to understand. The service records revealed that she had taken the Ferrari to a premium maintenance facility every few months, regardless of how little she had driven it. The technicians had noted that Mrs. Holloway always paid in cash and always asked detailed questions about the car's performance, despite rarely driving it above city speeds. One mechanic had written a note that she seemed to enjoy the car most, when it was simply parked in her garage, as if its presence alone brought her satisfaction. I understood that feeling completely. The Ferrari wasn't just transportation. It was proof of what she had accomplished without anyone's help or approval. It was her private victory over a world that had consistently underestimated her capabilities and ambitions. But the Ferrari wasn't the only surprise waiting in that garage. Behind a stack of gardening equipment, I discovered a filing cabinet that contained records of my grandmother's real estate investments. The documents revealed an empire I had never suspected, spanning multiple states and including everything, from residential rental properties to commercial developments. She had started small, as her letter had mentioned, with a duplex purchased after my grandfather's death. But over the decades, she had parlayed that initial investment into a portfolio worth millions. She had been buying, renovating, and selling properties while maintaining the facade of a simple widow living on a fixed income. The most impressive aspect of her business acumen was how she had managed to keep her success completely hidden from her family. She had used a series of business entities and property management companies to handle her investments, ensuring that her name rarely appeared on public records that might have alerted my parents to her true financial situation. One folder contained what appeared to be surveillance reports, though they were actually detailed notes she had compiled about my career progress. She had been tracking my job changes, salary increases, and professional achievements with the same attention to detail she applied to her real estate ventures. She knew about promotions I had received, projects I had completed, and career milestones. I had never shared with the family because I had assumed no one would be interested. The depth of her knowledge about my life was both touching and slightly overwhelming. She had been present in ways I had never realized, watching and documenting my journey toward independence and success. In some ways, she had been more invested in my achievements than my own parents had ever been. Another folder contained copies of emails she had exchanged with my former supervisors and colleagues. I learned that she had occasionally reached out to people I had worked with, not to interfere or gather gossip, but to better understand my professional reputation and accomplishments. The responses painted a picture of me that I rarely saw reflected in my family interactions, someone who was respected, competent, and valued by her peers. One email exchange particularly moved me. She had contacted my former boss at the marketing firm where I had gotten my first promotion, asking general questions about the company culture. His response had included unprompted praise for my work ethic and leadership potential. My grandmother had printed that email and highlighted the sections where he described me as one of the most dedicated professionals I've ever worked with, and someone with exceptional integrity and drive. The contrast between how my professional contacts saw me and how my family treated me was stark and painful. These strangers valued qualities in me that my own parents seemed incapable of recognizing or appreciating. As I continued exploring the garage, I found additional evidence of my grandmother's hidden prosperity. There were receipts for art purchases, jewelry appraisals, and travel expenses that revealed a lifestyle far more luxurious than anything she had displayed during family gatherings. She had taken cruises to Europe, purchased original paintings, and maintained memberships at exclusive clubs, all while letting my parents believe she was struggling financially. The final discovery was perhaps the most telling. Hidden behind a false panel in the garage wall was a safe containing cash, additional jewelry, and a series of journals that documented her thoughts about our family dynamics over the past decade. Reading her observations was like seeing my childhood and young adulthood through the eyes of someone who understood exactly what was happening but felt powerless to change it. Elena works twice as hard as David, but receives half the recognition, she had written after one family gathering. Today, she tried to tell her parents about a major client she had landed, and they interrupted her story to ask David about his latest photography project. I watched her face change, and I wanted to shake them both. Another entry, dated just 6 months before her death, revealed the final straw that had convinced her to change her will. They asked Elena to give up her car for David. After everything that girl has accomplished on her own, they want her to sacrifice more so that their golden child can have an easier path. I will not enable this pattern anymore. She had been fighting for me in ways I never knew, advocating behind the scenes and growing increasingly frustrated with my parents' inability to see what was happening to their own daughter. Her wealth hadn't just been about personal achievement. It had been about creating options for someone who had never been given any. The journals also revealed her growing awareness of her own mortality and her determination to use her final years to right the wrongs she had witnessed. She had spent considerable time researching the psychological effects of parental favoritism, consulting with estate attorneys about the best ways to structure her will, and even speaking with family therapists about whether there was any way to help my parents understand their destructive patterns. I realize now that I enabled this situation by giving them money over the years, she had written in one of her final entries. I thought I was helping the whole family, but I was actually making it easier for them to continue treating Elena unfairly. My legacy needs to be about correcting that balance, not perpetuating it. Standing in that garage, surrounded by evidence of her secret life and secret advocacy for me, I felt a profound mixture of gratitude and grief. She had seen me when my own parents couldn't, valued me when they didn't, and ultimately chosen me when they had consistently chosen David. But she had also carried the burden of watching my mistreatment for years without being able to stop it. The Ferrari key felt different in my hand now. It wasn't just a key to an expensive car. It was a key to understanding that someone in my family had believed I deserved beautiful things, successful things, things that reflected my true worth rather than the diminished value my parents had assigned to me. I started the engine, and the Ferrari purred to life with a sound that seemed to echo through the decades of my grandmother's hidden rebellion. This car had been her secret declaration of independence, her private celebration of success achieved without anyone's permission or approval. Now it was mine, along with the responsibility of honoring what it represented. Over the following weeks, I spent every free moment at my grandmother's house, slowly uncovering the layers of her carefully constructed dual existence. Each room revealed new secrets. Each closet contained additional evidence of a woman who had been living by her own rules while maintaining the facade that her family expected. The office I had barely noticed during childhood visits turned out to be a sophisticated command center for her real estate empire. Filing cabinets contained meticulously organized records spanning 4 decades of property transactions, renovation projects, and tenant management. She had owned apartment buildings, commercial spaces, and vacation rentals across 3 states, all managed through a network of property managers and business entities that kept her involvement largely invisible. What impressed me most was the strategic nature of her investments. She hadn't just bought properties randomly. She had researched emerging neighborhoods, identified undervalued areas before they became trendy, and sold at precisely the right moments to maximize her profits. Her success hadn't been accidental or lucky. It had been the result of careful planning, continuous education, and shrewd business instincts that no one in our family had ever suspected she possessed. A leather-bound ledger contained handwritten records of every transaction, complete, with her analysis of market conditions and personal notes about lessons learned. Her handwriting, which I remembered as shaky and uncertain during her final years, was bold and confident in these business documents from earlier decades. This was the writing of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and was proud of her accomplishments. I found correspondence with attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors that revealed the sophisticated infrastructure she had built to manage her wealth. She had established trusts, created LLCs, and structured her holdings in ways that minimized taxes and maximized privacy. This wasn't the work of someone who had stumbled into money. It was the systematic approach of a serious businesswoman who understood exactly how to build and protect wealth. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was the extent to which she had been subsidizing my parents' lifestyle without their knowledge of the source. Bank records showed regular transfers to accounts that I eventually realized were connected to my parents' mortgage, David's college expenses, and various family emergencies over the years. She had been their silent benefactor for decades, allowing them to maintain their middle-class lifestyle while actually living well beyond their means. The records revealed that my parents had been approaching her for financial help at least once, every few months for the past 15 years. The requests had started small: help with Christmas gifts, assistance with unexpected medical bills, contributions toward David's various educational and creative endeavors. But over time, they had become larger and more frequent, until my grandmother was essentially providing a significant portion of their household income. What made this discovery particularly painful was realizing how my parents had characterized their own financial situation to me over the years. They had claimed they couldn't help with my college expenses because money was tight, but the bank records showed them spending thousands of dollars on David's spring break trips during the same period. They had said they couldn't afford to help me with my first apartment deposit, but they had been receiving monthly supplements from my grandmother that would have easily covered such expenses. She had been asking them to share her generosity with me, and they had been pocketing the money while maintaining their narrative that I was too independent to need help. The betrayal felt fresh and raw, even though it had been happening for years without my knowledge. I found a folder labeled Elena Fund that contained records of money my grandmother had specifically earmarked for my benefit. Over the years, she had given my parents thousands of dollars with explicit instructions that it should be used to help with my education, my car purchase, or other major expenses I was handling alone. None of that money had ever reached me. The documentation was thorough and damning. She had kept copies of emails where she specified that certain transfers were for Elena's college expenses or to help Elena with her car situation. My parents had acknowledged these instructions and promised to pass along the support. But the money had apparently vanished into their general household budget, likely redirected toward David's ongoing financial needs. One email exchange from 3 years earlier was particularly devastating to read. My grandmother had asked my mother specifically whether I needed help with graduate school expenses, offering to cover the entire cost of an MBA program I had mentioned wanting to pursue. My mother had responded that I had decided not to continue my education because I was focused on working and didn't need additional schooling to succeed in my career. I had never made any such decision. No one had ever told me that graduate school funding was available. I had simply assumed, based on my family's history, that any advanced education would have to be entirely self-funded, and I had chosen to focus on gaining work experience instead. The opportunity to earn an MBA without debt had been stolen from me by parents who apparently viewed my grandmother's generosity as their personal resource to allocate as they saw fit. The final piece of the puzzle came in a series of increasingly frustrated letters my grandmother had written to my parents over the past 2 years. Her tone evolved from gentle suggestions to direct confrontation as she realized that none of her designated support for me was reaching its intended target. I am deeply disappointed to learn that Elena has been struggling financially while the money I specifically sent for her benefit has been used for other purposes, she had written in one letter. I trusted you to ensure that my support would help both of your children equally, but it appears that pattern of favoritism extends even to how you handle assistance from me. Her final letter to them, dated 8 months before her death, was a formal notice that she would no longer be providing financial support to their household. I have realized that my generosity has been enabling the same unfair treatment of Elena that I had hoped to counteract, she wrote. Until you can demonstrate that you are capable of treating your children equitably, I will be directing my resources elsewhere. That was when she had updated her will and begun planning the inheritance that would eventually come to me. Her decision hadn't been impulsive or vindictive. It had been the calculated response of a woman who had finally recognized that her well-intentioned support was actually making the situation worse for the granddaughter she was trying to help. Reading these documents felt like watching my entire family history rewrite itself. My parents hadn't been struggling financially. They had been living above their means with my grandmother's secret support. David hadn't been the recipient of his parents' sacrificial generosity. He had been the beneficiary of his grandmother's redirected funds. And I hadn't been the independent child who didn't need help. I had been the forgotten child whose designated help had been stolen before it could reach me. The letter I had been saving for last was tucked inside a wooden box that also contained the Ferrari keys, a copy of her updated will, and several photographs of me that I had never seen before. The envelope was marked, "For Elena, read last," in her careful handwriting, and I had respected her wishes even though my curiosity had been burning for weeks. When I finally opened it, I discovered that this wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, an apology, and a final gift all wrapped together in 3 pages of the most honest writing I had ever read. "My dearest Elena," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have discovered most of my secrets already. You know about the money, the properties, the car, and probably the truth about how your parents have been treating the support I sent for you over the years. I imagine you are feeling confused, betrayed, and perhaps angry at all of us, including me. She was right about all of those feelings. I had been cycling through anger, grief, and bewilderment for weeks as each new discovery reshaped my understanding of my family and my place within it. I need you to understand that I was complicit in your mistreatment for many years, she continued. I kept giving your parents money even after it became clear that none of it was reaching you. I told myself I was helping the whole family, but really I was just making it easier for them to continue their unfair patterns. I was an enabler, and I am deeply sorry for that. The apology hit me harder than any of the financial revelations had. She was taking responsibility for her role in perpetuating the system that had marginalized me throughout my childhood and young adulthood. It would have been easier for her to position herself as my secret advocate, but she was honest enough to acknowledge her own mistakes. The truth is that I was afraid, she wrote. I was afraid that if I stopped helping them financially, they would cut me out of your lives completely, and I would lose what little connection I had to you and David. I was afraid that confronting them directly about their favoritism would only make things worse for you. So I chose the coward's path of quiet enablement, and I have regretted that choice more deeply with each passing year. She explained that her decision to finally stop the financial support and change her will had come after watching my parents ask me to give up my car for David. That moment crystallized everything that was wrong with how they had been treating you, she wrote. Here you were, having worked for everything you owned, being asked to sacrifice for a brother who had never worked for anything. I realized that my money had been making that possible. The letter revealed that she had spent her final months not just arranging her financial affairs, but researching the psychological impact of parental favoritism and consulting with therapists about the best ways to help someone recover from such treatment. She had been reading books about family dysfunction, attending support groups for relatives affected by similar situations, and learning everything she could about how to leave. A legacy that would be healing rather than harmful. I chose you as my sole beneficiary, not just because you deserved it, but because I believed you were the only one who would use this inheritance wisely, she wrote. Your parents and David have never learned the value of money because they have never had to work for it. You understand what wealth really represents because you have built your own success from nothing. She had been watching my financial habits for years, noting how I saved carefully, spent thoughtfully, and invested in my own future rather than expecting others to provide for me. She trusted me with her legacy because she believed I would honor the work and sacrifice it represented. But more than the money, I want you to understand what this inheritance really means, the letter continued. It means that someone in your family saw your worth even when others couldn't. It means that your independence and strength didn't go unnoticed. It means that you were loved and valued, even if that love was never properly expressed while I was alive. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. For 34 years, I had felt fundamentally unlovable within my own family, constantly wondering what was wrong with me that made me less worthy of support and attention than my brother. To learn that someone had been seeing my true value all along, even from a distance, felt like a healing I hadn't known I needed. I know that inheriting money cannot undo the emotional damage of growing up feeling less valued than your sibling, she wrote. But I hope it can serve as proof that your worth was never actually in question. The problem was never with you, Elena. The problem was with people who were too limited in their vision to see what was right in front of them. She concluded with specific instructions about how she hoped I would use the inheritance. Some of the money should be used for my own enjoyment and security, she wrote, but she also encouraged me to consider using part of it to help other young women who were struggling without family support, just as I had done. Create the kind of family for yourself that you always deserve to have, she wrote in her final paragraph. Surround yourself with people who see your value without needing to diminish someone else's. And remember that the most important inheritance I'm leaving you isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that you are worthy of love, support, and every good thing life has to offer. The letter was signed simply, "With all my love and pride, Grandma Margaret," followed by a postscript that made me laugh through my tears. P.S. Drive the Ferrari. I bought it for the granddaughter who worked for everything she had, not for it to sit in a garage collecting dust. 6 months after that final letter, I was sitting in the driver's seat of my grandmother's Ferrari, watching my parents' shocked faces through the windshield of their living room window. I hadn't planned this moment of revelation, but sometimes life creates perfect circles of irony that are too beautiful to ignore. I had driven to their house to drop off a letter from my grandmother's attorney, informing them that their monthly financial support had permanently ended and explaining why. They deserved to understand that their treatment of me had consequences, and that someone had been watching their behavior more carefully than they realized. My mother had opened the door wearing the same expression of forced politeness she had perfected over the years, clearly not expecting to see me after our confrontation about the car. Her eyes immediately went to the Ferrari parked in their driveway, her confusion evident as she tried to process why I would be driving such an expensive vehicle. "Elena?" she said cautiously. "Whose car is that?" "Mine," I replied simply, handing her the envelope. "From Grandma Margaret's estate." The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in my adult life, my parents seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. They listened as I explained about the inheritance, the real estate portfolio, the years of financial support they had been receiving, and my grandmother's growing frustration with how they had been treating me. My father's face went through several color changes as I detailed my grandmother's attempts to ensure that some of her support reached me directly, and how that money had apparently vanished into their general household expenses instead of helping with my education or major purchases as intended. David, who had been summoned from the kitchen when the conversation began, stood silently as I explained how many of his opportunities had actually been funded by the grandmother he had barely acknowledged during family gatherings. His new job, which he had started with his reliable transportation needs, met by my old Honda, suddenly looked different when viewed through the lens of how that car had been acquired. "We didn't know she had that kind of money," my mother said, weakly, though her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You knew she was helping you financially," I replied calmly. "You knew she was specifically asking you to share that help with me. You chose not to." The silence that followed was heavy with 34 years of unaddressed inequality and willful blindness. For the first time, my parents seemed to be seeing their behavior from an outside perspective, and they clearly didn't like what they were discovering about themselves. David finally spoke up, his voice smaller than I had ever heard. I didn't know about the money she sent for you. I thought everything was coming from Mom and Dad." "I know," I said, and I meant it. David had been the beneficiary of our parents' favoritism, but he hadn't been the architect of it. He had grown up receiving preferential treatment without questioning whether it was fair or sustainable. "What happens now?" my mother asked, and I could hear genuine uncertainty in her voice for the first time in memory. "Now you figure out how to live within your actual means," I said. "And maybe, if you're willing to do the work, you figure out how to have healthier relationships with both of your children." I didn't stay long after that. There was nothing more to say that wouldn't have been repetitive or cruel. They had the information they needed to understand what had happened, and what they chose to do with that understanding was their responsibility, not mine. Driving away in the Ferrari felt symbolic in ways I was still processing. The car that had once represented my grandmother's secret rebellion against family expectations now represented my own freedom from those same limiting beliefs. I was no longer the forgotten daughter begging for crumbs of attention and support. I was a successful woman with resources, options, and the knowledge that at least one person in my family had always seen my true worth. The inheritance had changed my life in practical ways that were still unfolding. I had paid off my student loans, purchased a beautiful house in a neighborhood I had previously only dreamed of affording, and established an investment portfolio that would provide security for decades to come. But the emotional impact was even more significant than the financial one. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely worthy of good things. Not because I had earned them through suffering or sacrifice, but simply because I existed and had value as a person. My grandmother's gift had been more than money. It had been validation, recognition, and love expressed in the most concrete way possible. I had also begun the process of creating the kind of family my grandmother had encouraged me to build for myself. I was deepening friendships with people who appreciated my presence rather than tolerating it, dating someone who celebrated my successes rather than minimizing them, and generally surrounding myself with relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. The scholarship fund I established in my grandmother's memory was perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life. Working with young women who were navigating college and early careers without family support reminded me daily of how far I had come and how much strength I had developed during my own journey. These women understood the particular challenges of building a life without a safety net, the way every achievement feels simultaneously triumphant and lonely when you have no one to share it with, who truly understands its significance. Through mentoring them, I was healing parts of my own experience that I hadn't realized needed attention. My relationship with my parents remained complicated and distant, but it was no longer actively toxic. They had made some efforts to acknowledge their past behavior and to treat me more equitably in their communications. David had actually reached out several times to express his own understanding of how unfairly I had been treated growing up. Whether these changes would lead to genuine reconciliation remained to be seen, but I no longer felt desperate for their approval or validation. I had learned to value myself independent of their opinion, and that freedom was perhaps the greatest gift my grandmother had given me. 2 years later, I stood in the conference room of the Margaret Holloway Foundation, named in honor of my grandmother, watching 12 young women receive their first scholarship checks. Each of them reminded me of myself at their age, determined, hardworking, and navigating the challenges of building a future without family financial support. The foundation had grown beyond my initial vision, funded not just by my grandmother's inheritance, but by contributions from other successful women who understood the importance of supporting independence and self-determination. We provided not just financial assistance, but mentorship, networking opportunities, and the kind of emotional support that can make the difference between surviving and thriving. My grandmother taught me that true wealth isn't just about money. I told the scholarship recipients during the ceremony, it's about having the freedom to make choices based on your own values and dreams, rather than other people's limitations or expectations. The Ferrari still sat in my garage, driven occasionally but treasured more for what it represented than for its practical value. It reminded me daily that I came from a legacy of quiet strength and hidden resilience, that success sometimes requires patience and strategic thinking rather than immediate gratification. My relationship with my family had settled into a cordial but distant dynamic. We exchanged holiday cards and occasional phone calls, but the deep wounds created by years of favoritism would take more time and effort to heal than any of us had yet been willing to invest. That was okay. I had learned that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, and healing didn't require returning to relationships that had been fundamentally unhealthy. The house I had inherited became a gathering place for the chosen family I had built over the years. Friends, mentees, and colleagues regularly filled the rooms where my grandmother had once lived quietly, transforming her private sanctuary into a space of community and celebration. I often thought about what she would say if she could see how her legacy had evolved. I believed she would be proud not just of the financial growth of her investments, but of how those resources had been used to create opportunities for other women facing similar challenges. The most important lesson she had taught me wasn't about money, or real estate, or even family dynamics. It was about the power of seeing someone's true worth and acting on that recognition, even when it required challenging established patterns and expectations. Every day, I tried to honor that lesson by recognizing worth in others that they might not yet see in themselves, by creating opportunities where none had existed before, and by building the kind of world where a young woman's value isn't determined by how well she fits into someone else's vision of who she should be. My grandmother had given me more than an inheritance. She had given me a blueprint for how to love someone completely and how to create lasting change through patient, intentional action. That knowledge had become the foundation of everything beautiful I was building in my new life. Has life ever led you to create a family outside of blood ties? I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter. And if this journey touched something inside you, feel free to support the channel or pass this video along to someone who needs it.